In our class on white magic, continuing rule 11. And we're talking about thought forms and how to deal with them. And DK says he's talking about the third danger against where we left off. We were talking about the third danger against which the aspirant must guard himself is becoming obsessed by his own embodied ideas, be they temporarily right or basically wrong. So it was interesting that even a good idea, a person can be obsessed with it to the point to where he can be headed the wrong direction. If you get a bad idea, you're gonna be headed the wrong direction no matter what. But if you get a good idea, you can still take it the wrong direction. So he points out, if you get a good idea, you still need to handle it correctly to manifest it well. There are many people that have had good ideas, and then by the time they were implemented, it turns into a bad idea because it was implemented with a lot of mistakes and a lot of wrong input. He says, for instance, a seeker may see a partial truth and thinks he sees the whole picture. This is part of the problem when you do discover the truth. How much of the truth do you see? So many people see a truth, they think they see the whole picture, and this causes them to reject the greater truth when it is revealed. Okay, so this is interesting. Can you think of people seeing a truth but not seeing the whole truth and then screwing the dickens out of it so they're headed the wrong direction? Can you think of anything like that?
Well, the story of the blind man and the elephant.
Yeah, that's a really good example of how that happens.
But in reality, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. In reality, the communism, the idea of equality, of the equal value of work and people, it is a good idea. The communism.
Yeah, that's exactly the direction I was going to head, Asaf. So congratulations there. You read my mind. Right. So let's take the things that's creating the division among us. For instance, the big division in the United States right now, and also a lot of the world, is a lot of people think socialism is really good and they want to go that direction. And the other people say, no, this is screwed to the high heavens. We don't want to go this direction. And it's dividing them. Yet the essence of it is a good idea supported by everybody. That is, it would be nice if we could cooperate in such a way that everybody benefits. That's the basic idea behind socialism. And we do this on certain levels successfully. But if we take that idea and we say, okay, now here's the way we're going to implement this. Everybody has to give this amount and they got to give it whether they want to or not. And so we're going to create a bunch of laws that's going to force everyone to do what is right. Okay. And the legend has it that this was the war in heaven between Satan and Christ. Christ wanted to give everybody free will and teach them what was right and let them decide. Even if they decided wrong, let them go ahead and be wrong. Whereas according to the legend, Lucifer says, no, we can't trust the people to do what's right because they're going to screw up. So we can't give them free will. We have to tell them what to do and then make sure that they do it. And so this was supposedly what the big war in heaven was about free will. And so both sides, we have to see both sides of this playing out. Whether that story is right or wrong is beside the point. It's happening right here upon the earth. We have a war for free will. And the war for free will is on one side, both sides. We have good ideas, say, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could eliminate poverty, if we could, if everybody could be more generous, if there could be more sharing, if we could help the people that's starving to death in Ethiopia or wherever, and or if we could make sure there's no more poor or have better race relations. We all want these things, even though some people say, well, the people that don't think like me, they don't want this stuff. Well, yeah, we all want good stuff. Everybody wants good stuff. But how to go about achieving these good ideas, that's the real trick. And we have two ways, and what's creating the division is one side wants to use force to force people to do what is right. The other side says, no, we agree with the basic idea of sharing and things, but we need to leave it up to free will as much as possible. Now, you can't have extremes on both sides will not work. If you have no law at all and no enforcement of law, then you'll just have bedlam and nothing will work out. On the other hand, if you have way too much extreme of law, like I was reading about North Korea today, where they can't even listen to Western music over there. They can't listen to anything on the internet. They can't do anything because they're so afraid that they will do the wrong thing, that they feel they have to completely control the people there, even to the point of controlling their thoughts, to make sure that they do the right thing. Okay, so everybody can see in the Western world that North Korea is pretty much out to lunch, but a lot of people still push in that direction, and the ones that's pushing in that direction are heading, taking us to disaster. But on the other hand, we can't say we don't need any laws or controls at all. What we have to do is have enough control so there's maximum freedom. For instance, we can't allow the burglar to go enter your house or anybody's house that he wants. We can't give him that freedom. We have to control the guy so that if he does such a thing, then he has strong enough repercussions that it discourages most people from being a burglar. Okay, so you have to have controls, and that type of control ensures more freedom for the whole. So you have to have enough control to ensure maximum freedom for the whole, but we don't want so much control that free will is eliminated, so to the degree that you don't have the freedom of thought to really create innovative projects that will help humanity. So this is a big problem that we have, is everybody wants good stuff. Everybody wishes we could eliminate poverty. Everybody wishes we could have more equality, and we're just about everybody. So, but how to go about doing these things, this is where the division comes. And the division is focused on free will. One side always wants to do it by focusing on control. The other side wants to do it by focusing on maximum free will. And this is where the big fight comes in. There's a big disagreement between these two camps and the way they think, and they each see each other as the enemy that has to be eliminated, so that they feel that if they can eliminate the other side, then everything will be cool, and the world will be a great place. And that's the way both camps think. And
well, we have an unevolved humanity, and it's like in George Orwell's Animal Farm. Some of the animals want to be more equal than the others.
yeah, exactly right. That's a really great statement Orwell made. And Yeah, I was reading about North Korea just today, and there's a certain percentage of them that live in pretty good standards. I mean, and the rest of them, they don't seem to care that people are starving, having to eat tree bark to survive and stuff like this. They just don't. This camp that has the goods just don't seem to be concerned about the poor among them, and because they have theirs, and that's really sad. Um, Okay, so this is an important principle, that we understand. The principle of freedom is maybe the most important thing I have ever taught, is about the principle of freedom, because we have to have the principle of freedom in effect to produce spiritual progress, material progress, progress of any kind that you really want, that will benefit humanity, has to come through a certain amount of spirit of freedom. Without that freedom, then what we do is we look at North Korea as an end result. North Korea is an example of the end result of the principle of freedom being neutralized. Okay, he says, how shall a man guard himself from these dangers of just seeing the piece? He says, we see the piece of the puzzle. We see the peace that we want, peace on earth, or we want good things, but how do we see the whole picture? And he says, first and foremost, for the disciple, in taking care of his own spiritual needs, he must practice harmlessness. Okay? So this is one of the things that many of the groups are not practicing, is harmlessness. You have groups protesting on both sides. They get together and they attack each other, and some of them are physically attacking. There's been even some deaths and accidents, and people throwing acid or doing all kinds of crazy stuff. That the two camps, no matter whether you're on the side of freedom or control, it's important that the disciples, whatever you believe, you practice harmlessness, and you try to promote your ideas in as harmless a way as possible, so that you don't have to figure, well, how can I hurt the guy that I don't agree with? You don't look at it that way. You just say, how can I present my ideas so it can be understood? And then it's up to the recipient to whether or not he goes with it, if he does understand. Sometimes you can present an idea, it can be understood, but the guy just doesn't want to follow that path, even though he understands it. He said, secondly, the disciple must carefully monitor his thoughts, so old thoughts do not obstruct the new and positive ones which are considered. He says it takes years of effort to make the transition. For instance, how many people here were raised in a strong religious background? Anybody here? Okay, Curtis would be a good example. Have you noticed, Curtis, that Curtis was raised in a good Mormon family? Have you noticed that when people have left the church, that it takes years for them to really make the transition, that they kind of want to go back to the fundamentalist thinking?
Sometimes, like in my case where I was excommunicated, it was just a major lightning shift. I never wanted to go back.
Yeah, you're one of the few that just made the clean break.
Clean. They had no more control over me at all. In fact, I find that the pendulum swings the other ways. You know, kind of become overly liberated.
Remember that other kid that was excommunicated about shortly after you, and then he made a trip back to the church, and he heard a voice that said, "This is Zion," and he went back and groveled and got back in.
Got back in.
Yeah, do you remember his name? Who was that?
No, I erased him from my memory.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Some people just have a hard time just letting go.
And that platform has to be shattered. With me, it was shattered. With some people, they still have those strings that bind to pull them back over and over.
Yeah, yeah. I think most people here have done a pretty good job leaving their fundamentalist thought forms behind. Okay, Marcus and Jana, what's your background? Were you ever in a kind of standard religion?
My family isn't strong Mormon, but I was given the choice because I grew up in Utah, Utah County.
Yeah.
A little bit pretty heavy down there. I was given a choice when I was younger to if I wanted to go to primary when I was a kid and seminary school later on and stuff that I could, and so I chose to. So I did it to myself, basically, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Okay.
But so I wasn't necessarily raised with a strong religious background, but yeah, that's kind of where I was.
Okay. And what's your background, Janet?
Mostly it was Southern Baptist when I was younger. So it was fire and brimstone type of religion. But I got to participate in like LDS, Southern Baptist. I've even Catholic, Pentecostal. Like there's been lots of little. I got to have access to everything and learn.
Okay.
My family was Southern Baptist.
Oh, okay. So yeah, these teachings we grew up with sometimes like kind of pull on us. You know, the thing that affects people probably more than anything is the doctrine of hell. That people have a hard time letting go that well, if I leave the church or if I drink coffee or wine or whatever, I may go to hell. Or if I don't accept their version of Jesus exactly the way they decree it, I may go to hell. This is probably the most difficult thing. When Curtis and I were excommunicated, we'd sometimes talk to Mormons, and they would say to us, "You know, what you say makes a lot of sense, but you know, if there's one chance in 1,000 that you're wrong, you know, I could become a son of perdition and go live with the devil and the angels, his angels, for all eternity. And boy, I don't want that." And so just that thought scared a lot of them from even talking to us, you know. So letting go of that hellfire and damnation, that's the really, that's probably the most difficult thing for the religious people to let go of. I don't think that bothers old Rick over there, does it? You don't seem to be bothered about hellfire, Rick.
No, I'm not, and I'm not worried about death or anything like that. But the topic you're talking about, if you have a divine inspiration and you feel like you want to get it out to the most people possible, there are two authors, books or book series that just knocked me down. That has to do with why I didn't like DK and why I couldn't finish reading the Book of Mormon. Was you have this beautiful idea and you want to get it out to the whole world. So what do? You pick the best-selling author of all time who happened to write fiction, and you make it into like Shakespeare language, and it's like then you just lost the majority of people in the world because nobody speaks that way anymore, and they don't understand when people speak that way. So you took a good idea and you try to make it with the best presentation you could, and you pick something that, you know, it worked back in the 1600s, but you know, you start talking these and thous and all that, people are going to think you're a quack these days.
Yeah, well, that's why they do have a lot of more better translations today in English, and also more accurate translations. So that helps out somewhat. But still, a lot of people go back to the old King James, and I quote it quite a bit myself just because it's so much in use. Sometimes I'll use an English version when it's a lot clearer, but yeah, that old Queen's English doesn't quite do the trick anymore.
Yeah, I had a similar problem with the Book of Mormon. It's like, okay, he got this information from scrolls that were probably written somewhere around 1000 AD.
Yeah.
And then he translates them into Shakespearean English. What were you thinking? I mean, people in that was the Book of that was like 1830s.
Yeah.
And
what's interesting, there's a bunch of people that's claims to discovered plates since then, and they all translated it into that old English style. They think that that's the way that God wants them to talk.
I know it's like advertising. You're trying to give it an air of legitimacy by making it sound like the King James Bible, and it's like I didn't grow up with the King James Bible. I went to parochial school, Catholic. It's like, so King James Bible is like, oh, that was somebody's error, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Shakespeare was a good writer, but trying to make your writing sound like Shakespeare isn't going to gain you any listeners.
Yeah.
Okay. No, make us the good point, Rick.
Yeah, he says here it takes about 3 years after you break off from this old thought forms to kind of let them go. And that seems to be fairly accurate. How about you, Adam? You broke off from a religious thought form. Do you figure about 3 years sounds about right, or what do you think?
In my case, it was a pretty clean break, but there was a lot of residual things where mentally I knew how to get past it, but they're so part of how things are weaved inside your head, and that untangling those things is a little more difficult. But I think overall it was a pretty easy break for me.
Were you able to handle the fear of going to hell pretty good then?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was the easiest thing I ever did. I mean, I remember telling Marnie, and it was pretty hard on her at the time that I was leaving. But we talked, and it took a couple of years, and then I think she felt more comfortable with it. But it was, I never felt. It was quite the opposite. I felt so liberated. It was quite the opposite. There was no residual fear of going to hell, or, well, maybe I've made a mistake or anything like that. It was the most seamless process that I've ever been through.
Well, good. Well, we have an exceptional group here, because, yeah, I know a lot of people, they get, say, excommunicated, and then they beg and plead to get back in and kiss the ring of the authorities, and it's kind of sad.
There's a lot of Catholics. There's a lot of Catholics that still eat fish on Fridays.
Yeah.
It's been decades since they changed that rule.
Have they actually changed that rule? I haven't heard. I was wondering about that the other day. Do they?
For like 20 or 30 years now, Catholics have been able to eat meat on Fridays.
Oh, okay. But I did not know that.
But a lot of them still eat fish on Friday. It's just like an old habit that they can't break.
Yeah. You
what
get
do you
in a
think
habit. Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think? What do you think happened to all those Catholics that ate meat on Friday before they changed the rules? Are they still in hell or what? They better have a good Lord.
Yeah, you never know. Okay, let's move on to the next one. He says, the next thing, the disciple must learn to detach himself from his own creations and leave them free to accomplish their purpose for which he intelligently sent them forth. This fourth process, he says, falls into two parts. First of all, he says, by the use of the mystic phrase, he severs the link which holds the embodied idea in his thought aura. Remember, part of the rule is he utters forth the mystic phrase which will save him from their work. So this mystic phrase, apparently, he doesn't say a lot about it or define it, but it sounds like the mystic phrase isn't just one phrase, that for each thought form, there is a phrase which is spoken that registers, that begins to separate them, separate the thought form and let the thought form live on its own. And I was thinking about the founders of the United States when they produced the Constitution and our government, that they had to eventually let the creation go and live on its own. And can you think of the mystic phrase that was uttered that let it go?
In God we trust.
Okay, that's
Bibbidi
Okay,
bobbidi boo.
here's what I think it was. I think it was uttered by Benjamin Franklin. Do you remember? Can you? That gives you a hint. Can anyone figure out what the phrase might have been?
I might know it. He was talking to one of the other founding fathers, and they were like, "Oh, you know, we didn't get it right or something." And then one of them said, "Well, the people will see what we were going for, and they'll set it right."
Okay, that's a possibility. Here's what I think it was. Benjamin Franklin says, "You have a republic if you can keep it." I think that was a mystic phrase that set the country free of the founders, so it kind of was able to navigate on its own after that. But according to DK, there's some phrase that's uttered, like when Bill Gates left Microsoft to manage without him, he said something, probably gave a speech to the board of directors or whatever, and he made some statement that says, okay, I'm turning it over to you guys. I'm taking off doing charitable work and other stuff, so I'm turning it over to you guys. And I don't know if Steve Jobs ever did that. They went and fired Steve Jobs, and then they hired him again to save him, and he stayed with them pretty much till the end. So I don't know if he ever let it go, except for by his death. Perhaps his death was the mystic phrase. And I know he made an interesting statement just as he was dying that got quite a bit of press. What was that? He was talking. He saw something, and he says, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said, I think 3 times, something like that, and then he died. So he saw something pretty interesting that he was headed toward. So anyway,
wow.
the creator, once the thought form gets established, once he gets his creation established, he has to eventually let it live a life of its own. And he may still work with it, but like even Steve Jobs, when he was working with it, it was alive enough and had enough power that it didn't really need him anymore. And his death proved that. Okay, so yeah, somebody had a comment?
So it's like saying, go forth and multiply. Would that be a type of freeing statement that sets it free? Go forth.
Yeah, and you know, it may not even be physical words. It may just be a thought of some kind that the creator just lets his creation go. He still may be involved in it, but gets a life of its own. And I call this the satellite principle in my book of principles. In launching a satellite, the rocket on the launch pad, when it's first launched, has to have the most power exerted. So it gives the rocket gives a tremendous thrust. The first stage has a tremendous thrust to it, and it gets it up a few miles above the Earth, and then the second stage goes off. And it doesn't have as much thrust because it doesn't need as much power. And then the third stage, when they launched the first satellites in orbit. And the third stage didn't need as much power still. And then once it got to a speed of 18,500 miles an hour, I believe it was, then it did not need any thrust at all. Then the satellite went around in orbit indefinitely on its own inertia, because it reached the velocity necessary to maintain it in orbit. And this is the way it is with a creation. To create something, you need tremendous thrust to get it off the ground. Okay, you need to put 100% focused attention on your creation. And then as it starts to evolve, you have to continue to put attention on, but maybe you don't have to put quite as much, but you have to keep putting it on until it reaches the orbital velocity. And once it reaches this certain point, then it has a life on its own, and it can continue whether the creator is there or not. It's on its own from that point. This is the way it is with a business. You start a business, for instance, you got to put 100% attention on. Then after it becomes successful, you get somebody to manage it, and then you can go on vacation, and the business will continue to survive without you. And this is the point you want to reach with your thought form. Kay says a second thing: by detaching his mind from the idea, once he has sent it forth on his mission, he learns the lesson of the Bhagavad Gita that works without attachment. And he works without attachment. Okay? So the creator may continue to work with his thought form, but he works without attachment. In other words, a thought form, he come up with this great idea. He's got it going. It's manifesting. But then, as it becomes a manifest, he watches it evolve. He may continue to guide it, but he's not attached to the outcome. Like this molecule we're working on, once it becomes created, we don't know exactly where all it's going to go. So we have to detach ourselves from it, and to some extent, and say, let's just see where this thing is going to evolve to. And so this is just one example, and every creation that is manifest goes through the same process. When a business is really a great example of a creation, because we have seen many businesses develop, and some succeed and some don't. And the ones that succeeded, they often wind up with an end that's quite a bit different than the creator imagined it being when he died. For instance, Steve Jobs, for instance, is dead, but let's go ahead 100 years from now. Where's Apple going to be 100 years from now? Nobody knows for sure. So the creation can fulfill the vision of the creator to a certain extent, but then when it reaches a certain point, he has to let it go, because it's going to have a life of its own. A little bit like parents creating a baby. They say, well, I want my kid to be a doctor like I am, or architect. And so the parents try to guide the kid and give him guidance, and the guidance is helpful. But then the kid reaches a certain point in his life where he thinks, well, You know, I want to develop my own self according to what I want. I'm happy for my parents' guidance, but I am not my parent. I am me. And when we make a creation that's like our child, we want it to be according to what we want. But you reach a point where it's like a kid. You got to let it go and let it grow and just watch it and see what it does. Give it some guidance. Like even when your kid is 30 or 40, you still want to give him a little guidance and make sure he follows the right path. But you can only go so far because he's got a mind of his own. But doesn't mean you're going to ignore him. Doesn't mean you can't give him some guidance. But doesn't mean. But you can't control him either. So you can only control your thought form in the beginning, just like you can control a kid. When he's 4 years old, you exercise a lot of control over him. But when he gets older and older, then you have less and less control. And eventually, the parent has to just let the child do what the child is going to do. And you have to the parent has to let go to a certain degree. And the good parents can let go and still give a little bit of guidance as necessary. The bad parents still try to micromanage their children even when they're adults, and everybody's encountered those before.
AJ?
Okay, any comments or questions on that?
Yeah, JJ?
Yeah.
I have your mystic phrase for letting go of the molecule.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yeah. Thank God I'm done with those misfits and that riff.
That's funny.
I can relate to what you're talking about. When the keys was in the first few months, I had this vision of what the Keys of Knowledge group would be like. We'd be like studious, but we'd also be the friendliest bunch of group. We'd be all best friends for life kind of thing. And I wore all the hats. I was the sergeant of arms. I was the welcome committee. But over a period of just a few months, people were taking over. Somebody became the archivist. Somebody became the welcome committee. And it's like, and I was just happy as punch, pleased as punch to be able to hand out, their caps and take that hat off for myself and turn it loose. But there was a process of, I started off with all the ideas and then I implanted those into the group, and then people took over the different jobs.
Well, it's interesting. Many movements that kind of changed the world started out by people that were considered misfits. And, well, let's take the Mormon Church, for instance. The governor of Illinois is called the leaders among the Mormon Church unprincipled men of talent. Curtis and I always liked that phrase. We considered ourselves to be unprincipled men of talent by other people's standards. But the founders of our country were considered unprincipled men of talent by the royalty and so on. And this often happens even among businesses, like the guys that started the computers, Bill Gates and people like that were considered kind of strange. So don't worry if anyone thinks you're kind of strange, because the strange people are the ones that have changed the earth. Okay, any more comments on that idea? Next, he talks about salvation from death. And you see that headline of this section, Salvation from Death, and you think, well, it must be talking about physical immortality. And that's not what he means by salvation from death. By salvation from death, he means salvation from the fear of death and wrong concepts of death, and from death having a hold on you that is in a negative way. This is what he really means by salvation from death. If we understand life appropriately, then we understand that there is no death. And when the person reaches a consciousness where he understands there is no such a thing as death, then according to the way he's talking here, you are actually saved from death. He talks about the importance of controlling and stilling the emotional body so the mind can function correctly. An agitated thought form impedes thought, and this is one of the things that interferes with our salvation from death, is our emotional body. Our emotional body, well, we getting back to the fear of hell, for instance, that's something that really affects people's emotional body a lot. And the religions of the world from the beginning have controlled a lot of people by scaring them to death about hell. If you don't do what I say, well, you're going to go to hell and burn forever. Well, that, if the guy really believes that, he'll do some crazy stuff that he's been commanded to do by his leaders, whether he thinks, no matter what he thinks, like say they'll gleefully burn somebody at the stake. Say they burn witches at the stake in Salem, and reprobates, or people that question the Orthodox doctrine in the Middle Ages. They burn them at the stake, burned Joan of Arc at the stake, and the adherents did it happily because they thought if they disobeyed the leaders and didn't participate in stuff like this, then they'd go to hell themselves. And so this fear of hell has given tremendous control. And it's interesting that even people that are free from religion have this fear of hell complex in them to some degree, in the fact that they may not, even an atheist, he may not have a fear of hell in the next world, but he has a fear of going against the authorities that he esteems to be correct. And this produces a hellish nightmare for him to go against his authorities, even if he's an atheist. So no matter what belief system you have, this the principle behind the fear of hell influences people and gives authorities undue control over people's lives. And this has to be just shaken loose of. And it's a difficult thing for the disciples to let go of.
And there's a very strong fear of the unknown. People fear the abyss.
Right.
And in the Cedarcrans teaching, they talk about the second death. It's when you pass through this hole that your astral body has on you.
Yeah. They're people. A lot of people think if they can escape from a regular religion, well, this fear of hell is bother them anymore. But there's this fear of the unknown, fear of not being accepted by your peers, fear of a lot of things that bother us and give authorities power over the lives of people similar to the old-time religious people. He says, 2 things must be borne in mind as we seek to study this means of salvation. When he speaks of when he speaks of the body nature, he says he's speaking about the body, emotions, and mind. He's speaking about these 3. He calls them the worlds of form, the 3 worlds of form. See, somebody's not on mute. Let me check here. Okay. The average person utilizes the physical and astral bodies. The seeker advances until he utilizes the mind, coordinates all 3, and adds soul contact. So we have these 3 worlds of form. The physical, we must control that. The astral, the emotional body for people in this age is the most difficult to control because it has such a tremendous power over us. And even if you take somebody that's controlled on an emotional level and you lay out the reason why they should not have this control, and it may even make sense to their mind, but if they're controlled by their emotional body, they still go with their emotions. They may say something like, well, you may be right, and then they'll ignore you because their emotional body is stuck in this rut. They have a hard time getting out of the emotional control. So eventually we must go beyond the emotional control to where if something makes sense to the mind, it can override what you are feeling emotionally. And probably the biggest test of this is if you fall in love with the wrong person. How many times have you seen somebody fall in love with the wrong person and they still go with it, even though they realize in their mind, well, you know, the guy was released from prison and he's had a bad background and doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'm in love with him, so I'm going to go with it. Okay, so how many times have you seen this happen to people where their mind tells them one thing, but their emotions tell them something else? And there's no greater example of this than falling in love with the wrong person. And so if you fall in love with the wrong person, it's very difficult to overcome that. If you can then go to your mind and say, this person is wrong for me, even though I have this tremendous attraction, I'm going to let him go. If you can do that, then you have demonstrated power over the emotions, because that's pretty much the ultimate test. The ultimate test is the falling in love with the wrong person. And it's very hard to let that person go, because when you fall in love with somebody, you actually establish a strong emotional soul link with that person that is very difficult to sever and let go.
Been there and done that many times.
Yeah. Was it hard to let him go, Ed? Even
Well,
for you, master that you are?
I normally have tried to think that somehow I could be a beneficial presence in these people's lives, but it turns out that the benefit is not that great.
Yeah, you know, that's one thing that kind of gets advanced people, is they will think, well, you're dating somebody that nobody else available, so at the time, so you think, well, I can kind of help this person out, and then you get more emotionally attached, and then it's very hard to sever that relationship. And it all happened because you're just trying to be a good person. But sometimes trying to be a good person, like they say, no good deed goes unpunished. And a certain amount of truth to that. So anyone else had can really identify with falling in love with the wrong person?
I do.
You do? Have you fallen in love with the wrong person before?
Yes.
Yeah. Was it hard to let him go?
It was just extremely hard. I
Yeah.
mean, at the beginning, I was just developing this huge interest in her, and I sensed something was wrong, but I just couldn't let her go. You know, I just invited her to my home, and you know.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I've been attached to the wrong person a couple times, and it was really hard to let them go. And I would consider this the ultimate test. If you can let that wrong person go when you're in love with them, you have made a big step forward to the kingdom of the soul. So it's
exactly.
so that's about the ultimate test. I can't think of a greater emotional test than that.
There is more. Yeah, we had some wonderful times together, but in between those multiple times there was just so much pain and just so much drama and traumatic shocks and you at one point I received some strong impression to say goodbye and let it go, and that's what I did. And afterwards I just felt terrific.
It's a heck of a thing now to go through.
It was just I just felt an unprecedented just hope and optimism and
it doesn't matter how advanced you are spiritually. If you wind up falling in love with the wrong person, it takes a lot of control to master the situation. Anybody else fall in love with the wrong person?
Yeah, JJ, it's practically the story of my life.
You've had some interesting experiences, haven't you?
Yeah, I really have. But isn't there a story in the Aquarian Gospel about Jesus or somebody's in heaven and falls in love and has to leave them to go to work?
Well, in the Aquarian Gospel, one of the tests was in the Great Pyramid, I think it was, or in the city of Heliopolis. He was given these tests, and he met this Israeli girl that came and danced in front of him and sang the songs of Israel. And the Aquarian Gospel says, and she made the heart of Jesus to burn. It said, and he fell in love with her. He fell in love with her, but he had to let her go, and that was one of his tests, according to the Aquarian Gospel. I love that statement where it says she made the heart of Jesus to burn, and you don't think of that about Jesus, of his heart burning with passion toward falling in love with somebody like that, from reading the regular Gospels. But I like that phrase, and it made me really identify with Jesus when I read that. I thought, he comes alive as a real person in this story, and I really like that. Those tests that he passed are very fascinating to read in the Aquarian Gospel. Okay, any other lost loves anyone wants to talk about here?
There is more to the story, but I'll let it go for now.
Yeah, I can identify with you. Yeah, we're a little bit short of time here, but with your story there, it's probably, once you start telling a story about a lost love or something like that, it's to really give it the details, it takes some a little bit of time. But yeah, we identify with you there.
My little brother's constantly emailing me, asking me what should he do. He wants to be in love with this girl on the internet, and she just needs $100 to come visit him. And my best advice was, Jay, just tell him you can call me honey until you ask for money.
Now I have an interesting story about Curtis. Are you there, Curtis? Are you still with us?
I'm still with you, Brother Joe.
I had a revelation on Curtis one time. I mean, it just came, my soul just gave that to me really powerfully. He was dating this gal, and I can't remember her name. What? Vicky. Yeah, Vicky. Yeah, Vicky, who was her name. And I didn't have any reason to get this. She seemed fairly nice. She wasn't a real spiritual gal, but she was interesting. And I just received this really strong that it's important that Curtis drop her. Because if he winds up marrying her, it will really set his life back. And I got this really strong, and I told it to him, and he was really in love with this gal. But it made him think, and you eventually did drop her. What finally made you decide to drop her, Curtis?
She wasn't going the same direction, and she was very controlling and very materialistic. And then when you brought that to my attention, it's like another light went on. Aha. And I could see. So after you told me that, I just went out and broke up with her the very next day.
You did it the very next day?
Oh, pretty close.
Really?
And then, yeah, but it was hard because I kept wanting to go back to her because she was very beguiling and very intriguing, and she had a very highly developed personality. But you're right, it would have set me back, and I never would have.
Yeah, she was probably, I bet she was real passionate too, wasn't she?
Yeah, she's very passionate.
That makes that even more difficult.
Oh, that's a lifetime ago. But I never would have had the LA experience. I never would have left Boise. I had so many things I had yet to do that she would have kept me from.
Yeah, usually you don't.
Long after you told me that I had broken up with her.
Yeah, usually you don't get a revelation on somebody else's personal life, but for some reason that was, my soul told me it was extremely important. And so, so I told him about that, and I'm glad he listened, because I'm sure his life is a lot different than it would have been otherwise.
Oh yeah, 180 degrees. Thank you, Brother Joe.
Well, thank the Spirit. I mean, I really had nothing to do with it, except I just got that message just really strong. It's really unusual for me to get a message like that. But okay, any other comments or questions before we wrap it up? Been a good group today, and you guys are really good about dealing with your emotional selves. You're very focused on doing what's right no matter what, so I'm proud of you guys. So we will see you next Sunday then, all being well.
They say that a horse wants to run back into a burning barn because it's the only thing it knows.
Probably so.
I heard that too, Ed.
That's an interesting statement, Ed.
That's why they put a cloth around its eyes so it can't do that when it goes out of a burning barn.
Yeah.
Blindfolded. Go out blindly.
Yep. Okay, well, we'll sign off then, and we'll see you guys next week.
Okay. So long, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Night.
Bye, Dee Dee.
Life, love, and